In July 2017, Timothy Chavira walked out of a California state prison after serving nearly 3 decades for murder. He had been convicted in 1986 of first-degree murder for beating and stabbing his stepmother to death. The sentence was 26 years to life. By 2017, the system determined he was suitable for release. 2 years later, on December 7, 2019, a 76-year-old retired physician, Dr. Editha Cruz de Leon, was found murdered inside her home in the El Sereno neighborhood of Los Angeles in the 3900 block of North Van Horn Avenue. The man charged with her killing was the same parolee, Timothy Chavira. This is not simply a story about one man committing 2 murders decades apart. It is a story about risk, about how institutions evaluate it, how time changes it, and how sometimes the promise of rehabilitation collides with irreversible consequences. When parole boards say someone is ready, what evidence are they relying on? And what happens when that judgment proves catastrophically wrong? In 1986, Timothy Chavira murdered his stepmother. Court records confirm that the killing involved both beating and stabbing. He was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to 26 years to life in California State Prison. For decades, that conviction defined him. Inside prison, inmates serving life terms for murder often enter long cycles of programming, disciplinary monitoring, and psychological evaluation. California's parole system evaluates both static and dynamic factors: the severity of the original offense, prior criminal record, institutional behavior, expressions of remorse, and psychological risk assessments. Time is a powerful variable. Research consistently shows that violent recidivism rates decline with age. A person in their 20s at the time of offense statistically presents lower risk in their 50s. By the mid-2000s, Chavira had served roughly 30 years. In July 2017, he was granted parole. Parole suitability does not erase the original crime. It reflects a finding that the inmate no longer poses what California law defines as an unreasonable risk of danger to society. Unreasonable risk does not mean no risk. It is a probabilistic judgment. The board must weigh decades-old violence against institutional behavior, psychological reports, and insight statements. At that moment, the system concluded Chavira was safe enough to re-enter the community under supervision. For nearly 2 years, there were no headlines. Then came December 7, 2019. On December 7, 2019, Dr. Editha Cruz de Leon was found dead inside her El Sereno home. She was 76 years old, a retired physician, widely described as respected and active in her community. Authorities determined she had been killed with a sharp object. The Los Angeles County District Attorney's Office later confirmed the cause of death involved sharp force injuries. Roughly 2 weeks after the killing, Chavira was arrested. The connection between Chavira and Dr. de Leon was not described in public charging documents as a random act, nor was a detailed motive publicly outlined at the time. Prosecutors declined to provide specific motive details in early reporting. What was clear, however, was that the suspect in this second homicide had already served nearly 3 decades for a prior first-degree murder. The public reaction was immediate and sharp. How could someone convicted of murder be released and then kill again? The question becomes more layered. A prior homicide is one of the strongest predictors of future violent behavior. Yet aging significantly reduces recidivism risk. Structured risk assessment tools often incorporate both factors. Chavira's release in 2017 was not outside legal norms. It reflected California's statutory framework and parole review standards. But the 2019 killing became a devastating outlier, the kind that reshapes public trust. On June 22, 2020, Chavira pleaded guilty to the 2019 murder of Dr. Editha Cruz de Leon. The Los Angeles County District Attorney's Office announced that he was sentenced to life in state prison without the possibility of parole. This second life sentence removed any future release calculation. The system that once assessed him as a manageable risk now classifies him as permanently irredeemable under the law. If you're drawn to true crime stories that reveal the full picture, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us continue to investigate, research, and share the cases that matter. Moving from Case 1 to Case 2. 6 years after his release, in 2010, Flick attacked another woman. He slashed her in the face with a knife. She survived. He was convicted of aggravated assault and sentenced to 4 years in prison. This was not his first act of lethal violence. It was not even his first knife attack. By 2010, Albert Flick had already served decades in prison for murdering his wife. The assault should have stood as a warning, not of possibility, but of pattern. It demonstrated continuity. It showed that the passage of time, including 25 years behind bars, had not erased his willingness to use a blade against a woman with whom he had a relationship. 8 years later, that pattern would end in another death. How does a man with a documented history of killing and knife violence return to the community more than once and kill again? The answer lies not in a single decision, but in a sequence of decisions made over decades. Albert Flick's first homicide occurred on August 4, 1979, in Lewiston, Maine. Inside a laundromat, he stabbed his wife, Sandra Flick, 14 times. Witnesses saw the attack unfold. It was not concealed. She died from her injuries at the scene. The brutality of the assault and the public nature of it left little ambiguity about what had happened. He was convicted of murder and sentenced to 30 years to life in prison. The sentence reflected the seriousness of the crime. Yet even a life sentence with the possibility of parole carries a future review date. For approximately 25 years, Flick remained incarcerated. During that time, prison records documented disciplinary issues, including threatening behavior and confrontations with staff or other inmates. These records did not erase his eligibility for parole. In Maine, parole decisions are structured around statutory criteria. The parole board evaluates conduct while incarcerated, participation in programming, psychological evaluations, age, and the feasibility of supervision in the community. The question before the board is not whether the original crime was severe. That is already established by conviction. The question is whether the individual can be safely released under conditions. In 2004, Flick was released on parole at age 57. A man approaching 60 statistically poses less risk than he did in his 20s. Many parole decisions across the country rely in part on that empirical trend. The assumption is not that people become harmless automatically, but that the probability of serious violence decreases with age. In 2010, the attack that opened this account made that clear. Flick's slashing of another woman's face with a knife was not random street violence. It was directed and personal. The victim survived, but the act itself reintroduced a weapon and a dynamic that mirrored his past. He was convicted of aggravated assault and sentenced to 4 years in prison. The justice system responded, recorded the conviction, and imposed incarceration. After serving that 4-year sentence, Flick was released again. The file documenting his history grew thicker. A 1979 murder conviction, a 2010 aggravated assault with a knife, disciplinary records, supervision terms. Each entry was part of an official record. By early 2018, Flick was on probation in Maine. Court records show that prosecutors sought to revoke that probation due to violations and concerns about his behavior. There were reports that he had been following Kimberly Dobby and appearing near places where she stayed. These concerns were brought before the court. In May 2018, a judge declined to fully revoke his probation. Flick received a short jail sanction, but was returned to supervision in the community. The court weighed the violations against statutory standards and proportionality. The decision was lawful. It was also consequential. 2 months later, on July 15, 2018, Flick met Kimberly Dobby outside a laundromat in Lewiston to discuss matters involving their young son. Surveillance footage later presented at trial showed Flick sitting on a bench. Dobby approached him. The interaction lasted moments. Then Flick stood and stabbed her repeatedly. There was no extended struggle visible in the footage. The attack was swift and direct. Dobby's 11-year-old twin sons attempted to intervene. One tried to push Flick away with a bicycle. It did not stop the assault. Emergency responders arrived, but Dobby died from multiple stab wounds at the scene. The setting carried an unsettling echo. In 1979, Flick killed his wife in a laundromat. In 2018, he killed Dobby outside one. The physical environment was similar. The method was the same, a knife. The target was the same, an intimate partner. Nearly 40 years separated the two murders. The underlying behavior did not change. Albert Flick was charged with murder and tried in 2019 in Knox County Superior Court. Prosecutors presented surveillance footage and eyewitness testimony. They highlighted his prior murder conviction and the 2010 knife assault, emphasizing the continuity in conduct. The defense challenged aspects of intent, but the central facts of the stabbing were not in dispute. The jury deliberated for less than an hour before returning a guilty verdict for murder. On August 9, 2019, Flick was sentenced to 65 years in prison. At age 77, the sentence effectively ensured he would spend the remainder of his life incarcerated. Now we turn to Case 3. The forensic record was detailed. According to the Pennsylvania Supreme Court's opinion, physical evidence linked Arthur Jerome Bomar Jr. to the crime scene and to Amy Willard's body. DNA testing connected him to the sexual assault. Tire impressions were consistent with his truck. Blood and fiber evidence supported the prosecution's case. Those findings would ultimately secure a conviction. But before the verdict, before the death sentence, there was June 19, 1996. Amy Willard was 22 years old. She was a senior and lacrosse player at George Mason University. That night, she left a Philadelphia nightclub and began driving north toward her family home in Horsham. Witnesses later described a light-colored pickup truck tailing her vehicle on Interstate 476. By the end of the investigation, that truck would be traced to Arthur Jerome Bomar Jr. The evidence was technical, the violence was personal, and the man convicted had already once been paroled for murder. Amy Willard's car was found abandoned along the highway. Her body was discovered in Fairmount Park. She had been beaten, sexually assaulted, and strangled. Investigators built the case through physical reconstruction. Tire track comparisons matched Bomar's pickup. Fibers recovered from Willard's clothing were consistent with materials inside his vehicle. Blood evidence and DNA analysis linked him directly to the assault. The prosecution presented this forensic chain at trial in Montgomery County in 1998. The jury convicted Bomar of first-degree murder, rape, kidnapping, aggravated assault, and abuse of a corpse. On December 4, 1998, he was sentenced to death. The evidentiary record was not circumstantial guesswork. It was layered and technical. Appellate courts reviewed the case. In 2003, the Pennsylvania Supreme Court affirmed the conviction and sentence. Further appeals were later denied. The legal conclusion was firm. But the timeline of this crime does not begin in 1996. It begins in 1978. In Nevada, Bomar was convicted of killing Larry Carrier. He received a life sentence. Years later, he was paroled. That decision returned him to society. When Amy Willard drove home that night, the man who would be convicted of killing her had already once been evaluated and released after homicide. Parole decisions rely on structured review. Boards examine institutional conduct, psychological evaluations, program participation, and time served. They consider disciplinary history and reports from correctional staff. They weigh public safety against the principle of rehabilitation. Bomar had served years for the Nevada homicide before being released. Release does not erase history. It signals that the system believes continued confinement is no longer necessary. But incarceration restricts behavior within a controlled environment. It does not test conduct under stress, rejection, or opportunity outside prison walls. The Willard case exposed a weakness in interstate supervision. Bomar moved from Nevada to Pennsylvania. Supervision structures existed, but coordination across state lines was limited. Monitoring was administrative, not omnipresent. After Willard's murder, public outrage was immediate. In 2000, Congress passed legislation commonly known as Amy's Law, designed to impose financial penalties on states that released violent offenders who then committed serious crimes in other states. Law changed, oversight tightened, but policy reform followed loss. Psychologically, violent recidivism is complex. Research shows most parolees do not commit homicide, yet prior violent convictions increase statistical risk. Predictive tools estimate probability using past behavior patterns. They cannot measure dormant aggression or internal persistence. Certain offenders demonstrate long-term antisocial traits, impulsivity, lack of empathy, predatory behavior that may remain stable over time. Compliance in prison may reflect adaptation to structure rather than transformation of character. In Bomar's case, the forensic evidence established physical guilt. The prior conviction established violent history. The parole decision created opportunity. The system cannot see intent before action. It relies on behavior history and probability models. Arthur Jerome Bomar Jr. remains on death row in Pennsylvania. The courts affirmed the verdict. The evidence was reviewed. The sentence was imposed. If you want more true crime stories told with clarity and purpose, don't forget to like and subscribe. Your support helps us keep uncovering cases and bringing the facts to light. Case 4. Eugene Blake was sentenced to life in prison in 1969 for murder. A decade later, in 1979, he was released on parole. Within 3 years of regaining his freedom, he killed again. Blake's first confirmed homicide took place in 1967 in West Virginia. The victim was Donna Jean Ball. Details from court records established that the crime was serious enough to warrant the most severe penalty available under state law at the time. In 1969, Blake was convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment without mercy, a designation that carried a clear meaning in West Virginia. No eligibility for parole. The sentence was intended to remove him permanently from society. But in 1976, a legal shift changed that outcome. Governor Arch A. Moore Jr. commuted Blake's sentence from without mercy to with mercy. The distinction may sound subtle, but in practical terms, it was profound. With mercy meant parole eligibility after a specified period of incarceration. The life sentence remained, but the door to conditional release was opened. In February 1979, after serving approximately 10 years, Eugene Blake walked out of prison. He was 34 years old. The state believed rehabilitation had occurred, or at least that he no longer posed an unacceptable threat. Parole decisions often rely on institutional conduct, time served, and perceived readiness for reintegration. On paper, Blake met the threshold. The next 5 years would test that belief. For more than a decade, prison had structured Blake's existence. Movement was regulated. Hierarchy was enforced. Routine was controlled. Decisions were made within a rigid framework. Daily life inside confinement operates on predictability. Count times, meal schedules, work assignments, restricted interaction. Identity forms within those boundaries. Re-entry dismantles that structure instantly. Psychologists describe this adjustment challenge as institutional dependency, a condition in which a person's sense of order, status, and identity is built around confinement. Outside prison walls, identity must be self-generated. Choices are no longer dictated by the institution. Structure becomes personal responsibility. After his parole, Blake relocated within the Ohio Valley region. He was no longer an inmate. He was a free man under supervision. On March 18th or 19th, 1982, records vary slightly depending on jurisdictional documentation. 21-year-old Mark Withers was shot and killed in Bridgeport, Ohio. The homicide was direct and immediate. Withers was killed by gunfire. The circumstances indicated intentional violence rather than accident or spontaneous dispute. The same night, a 17-year-old girl was abducted and sexually assaulted. She survived the attack. The Withers murder remained unsolved for decades. At the time, investigators lacked the forensic tools that would later become routine. DNA profiling was not yet a standard investigative resource. The case eventually went cold, but the pattern had resumed. This was not a bar altercation or sudden argument that escalated beyond control. It involved targeted violence and sexual assault, conduct consistent with Blake's earlier criminal history. The release from prison had not erased the capacity for lethal force. It had placed him back into an environment where that capacity could operate. Re-entry did not neutralize violent capability. It exposed it. 2 years later, in October 1984, 13-year-old Marianne Hope Helmbright was abducted and murdered in West Virginia. Her disappearance triggered concern within the community before her body was later recovered. The crime involved sexual assault as well as homicide. Blake was arrested, tried, and convicted for Helmbright's murder. He received a sentence of 15 years to life in West Virginia. By this point, Blake was incarcerated again. However, the 1982 Ohio homicide of Mark Withers remained unresolved. No conviction had yet tied him to that earlier killing. For 26 years, the Withers case sat dormant. Then, forensic science advanced. In 2008, improvements in DNA analysis reopened the file. Biological evidence collected in 1982 was re-examined and tested against modern databases. The results linked Eugene Blake to the murder of Mark Withers and to the sexual assault of the teenage survivor. The cold case was no longer cold. Blake was extradited to Ohio to face charges. In 2010, he pleaded guilty to the Withers murder. The court sentenced him to 20 years to life. That phrase would later become central to his legal timeline. The sentencing entry did not specify 20 full years. Under Ohio law, that omission created a technical interpretation issue. Without explicit language requiring 20 full calendar years before eligibility, Blake became eligible for parole consideration after serving approximately 14 years, roughly 70% of the stated minimum term. This was not the result of legislative reform or a shift in public policy. It was the result of sentencing language. The 2022 parole hearing was not early release triggered by broad reform. It was the consequence of a drafting omission in the 2010 sentencing entry. In June 2022, Blake appeared before the Ohio Parole Board. Families of the victims objected strongly to the possibility of release. The hearing itself was legally permissible because of the wording in the sentencing record. But parole eligibility is not parole approval. The board denied release, citing risk of future criminal conduct and insufficient evidence of rehabilitation. Blake remained incarcerated. His next hearing was scheduled for 2032. Another layer complicates his legal history. In 1991, Blake's original 1969 conviction for the murder of Donna Jean Ball was technically vacated through a habeas corpus proceeding. The vacatur addressed procedural concerns in the earlier case. However, he was not retried. By that time, he was already serving a life sentence for the 1984 murder of Marianne Helmbright. The vacatur did not restore freedom. It altered procedural history. Legally, his incarceration continued uninterrupted because of the later conviction. The technical status of the earlier case changed, but the practical reality did not. Up next is Case 5. The most unsettling detail in Maust's history is not only that he killed again, it is that he said he would. He reportedly warned authorities that he would commit murder again if released. Statements like these are layered and difficult to interpret. Some offenders posture for attention. Some exaggerate to appear more dangerous than they are. Some attempt to manipulate the system by presenting themselves as too volatile for reintegration. Within prison culture, Threats can function as currency. They can shape reputation. They can create distance. They can alter how others respond. A warning is not always a promise. It can be performance. It can be defiance. It can be an effort to control narrative. But in David Edward Maust's case, the warning did not remain theoretical. It aligned with what would later unfold. On June 25, 1999, Maust was released on parole after serving approximately 17 years for murder. He had entered prison in early adulthood and was leaving in middle age. By the end of 2003, 3 teenage boys and young men would be found buried beneath concrete inside his home in Hammond, Indiana. The system had assessed him. It had documented his conduct. It had weighed his age, his disciplinary record, and his time served. It had determined that supervision in the community was an acceptable risk. Within 4 years, that assessment would collapse under the weight of new victims. By the time of his release in 1999, Maust was 45 years old. Statistically, violent recidivism declines with age. Decades of criminological research show that younger offenders, particularly those in their late teens and early 20s, commit violent crimes at higher rates than individuals entering middle age. Risk curves trend downward over time. Institutional behavior often stabilizes. Impulsivity tends to lessen. Structured evaluations indicated that his risk could be managed through parole conditions and monitoring. His prison record did not reflect constant disciplinary infractions. He had served nearly 2 decades. On paper, the profile suggested aging out of peak violence. But David Edward Maust was not a statistical average. Born April 5, 1954, his violent history dated back to the 1970s. In the early 1980s, he was convicted in Illinois for the murder of a teenage boy. Over time, additional killings across multiple states were attributed to him, bringing his total known and suspected lifetime victim count to at least 5. The pattern that emerged was specific. He targeted young males. He used proximity. He relied on familiarity. The victims were not strangers encountered by chance in distant locations. They were individuals who came into his orbit. He had demonstrated a pattern of targeting adolescent boys and young men. He had served nearly 2 decades in custody. He had reportedly warned that he would kill again. The tools used to evaluate him focused on measurable behavior, compliance with rules, participation in programs, age at release, documented infractions, and psychological assessments based on observable responses. These instruments assess what can be recorded. They quantify behavior in structured settings. They attempt to predict risk through patterns visible on paper. They cannot directly measure concealed intent. They cannot determine with certainty whether predatory fixation has dissolved or simply become dormant. They cannot fully assess whether a long period without opportunity equals rehabilitation or merely interruption. After his parole in June 1999, Maust relocated to Hammond, Indiana. There was no immediate public sign of renewed violence. Supervision protocols were in place. Movement appeared ordinary. The premise of parole rests on the belief that structured oversight, combined with time served and age progression, reduces danger to a manageable level. Reintegration is not declared safe. It is deemed acceptable within calculated risk thresholds. By 2003, 3 young males were reported missing: Michael Dennis, 13, James Regagni, 16, and Nicholas James, 19. Each had contact with Maust. The disappearances did not initially reveal a common thread to the broader public. Missing youth cases can appear unrelated until patterns surface. In December 2003, law enforcement executed a search warrant at Maust's Hammond residence. What followed shifted the investigation from suspicion to confirmation. Investigators uncovered human remains buried beneath cement inside the house. The bodies had been encased in concrete and concealed under structural flooring. This was not an impulsive disposal of evidence. It required preparation. It required physical labor. It required tools to mix and pour cement. It required waiting for the material to cure. The concealment was deliberate and structural, integrated into the home itself. Forensic excavation confirmed staged burial beneath poured concrete. The concealment reflected planning. It reflected calculation. It reflected confidence that detection would not occur quickly. It suggested that the offender believed he had time and privacy sufficient to construct physical barriers between the victims and discovery. The method did not indicate a sudden loss of control. It indicated continuity of behavior consistent with prior patterns of targeting. This was not spontaneous violence. It was sequential. It was methodical. It happened across months, possibly years, after a formal decision had been made that supervised release was appropriate. Moust was arrested in December 2003. In 2004, he pleaded guilty to the Indiana murders. He received multiple life sentences without the possibility of parole. The legal response was definitive. There would be no second release. There would be no recalibration of supervision terms. There would be no further evaluation of manageable risk. The system responded with permanence, but the murders had occurred after a structured process had concluded that he was suitable for re-entry. His earlier warning, once potentially dismissed as posturing or exaggeration, had aligned with action. The evaluation tools measured age, compliance, and institutional conduct. They did not, and perhaps could not, measure whether intent had remained intact. David Edward Moust died by suicide in prison in 2006. Moving on to Case 6. Before legal strategy could unfold, Stephen Pratt broke down in court. In front of Judge Michael Donio, he sobbed and said, "I don't want a trial. I'm guilty." He made the statement despite being advised to wait for counsel. The outburst happened during his 2014 arraignment in Atlantic County, New Jersey. It was not a calculated plea entered after negotiation. It was not the product of legal consultation. It was immediate and emotional. Pratt was 45 years old at the time. He had been free for just 2 days. The charge placed before the court was the killing of his 64-year-old mother, Gwendolyn Pratt. 2 days earlier, he had walked out of prison after completing a 30-year sentence for a different homicide. That timeline is not disputed. The sequence is precise. He completed his sentence. He returned home. Within 48 hours, his mother was dead. The emotional collapse in court was sudden. The violence that led to it had unfolded even faster. How does a man spend nearly his entire adult life incarcerated for murder, regain his freedom, and within 2 days commit another fatal act inside the very home that offered him shelter? The answer begins decades earlier. In 1984, Stephen Pratt was 15 years old when he shot and killed his neighbor, Michael Anderson, during a dispute in Atlantic City. Prosecutors chose to charge him as an adult. In 1986, he was convicted of murder and sentenced to 30 years in prison. He would serve nearly all of it. From adolescence into middle age, his life unfolded inside correctional facilities. The world outside moved forward without him. Technology changed. Neighborhoods shifted. Generations grew up. Inside prison, daily life followed institutional structure. Wake-up times were fixed. Meals were regulated. Movement was monitored. Conflict operated within defined systems enforced by correctional officers and prison policy. Prison is restrictive, but it is also predictable. For nearly 3 decades, that predictability shaped his adulthood. By October 2014, his sentence had run its course. There was no discretionary extension. He had completed the time imposed by the court in 1986. He walked out of prison at age 45. Freedom after long incarceration is abrupt. The gate opens. The structure disappears. Responsibility transfers instantly back to the individual. Pratt returned to Atlantic City and moved into his mother's home. Gwendolyn Pratt offered him housing and support during re-entry. Family housing is the primary stabilizing factor after release. It provides a mailing address, a bed, a familiar presence. After nearly 3 decades away, the adjustment to civilian life began immediately. It ended just as quickly. On October 21, 2014, police were called to the residence. Inside, they found Gwendolyn Pratt dead from massive blunt force trauma to the head. Authorities determined that she had been struck repeatedly during a confrontation inside the home. Stephen Pratt was arrested soon afterward. 30 years served, 2 days free, another life lost. Investigators reported that the killing followed an argument. There was no sign of forced entry. No evidence suggested an outside assailant. The violence occurred within the home. It was domestic and immediate. The injuries were caused by blunt force. Prosecutors described repeated blows during a confrontation that escalated beyond control. He was charged with murder. The emotional confession at arraignment drew attention precisely because it was unfiltered. He sobbed openly. He declared guilt before speaking with defense counsel. The courtroom moment was intense and unscripted, but emotion in court does not explain what occurred inside the house. The re-entry period after long incarceration is widely recognized as one of the most unstable transitions in the justice system. Decades inside prison reshape identity, autonomy, and conflict response. Choices in prison are limited. Confrontations occur within a regulated environment. Release restores full autonomy instantly. That restoration can be overwhelming. At 45, Pratt was beyond the demographic most associated with peak violent crime. The fatal argument inside that Atlantic City residence escalated rapidly. No public record indicates a prolonged plan or premeditated scheme. It appears to have been a confrontation that turned deadly within minutes. The aftermath moved quickly through the legal system. In 2016, at age 47, Stephen Pratt pleaded guilty to aggravated manslaughter. The murder charge was resolved through that plea. He was sentenced to 25 years in prison under New Jersey's No Early Release Act. That statute requires individuals convicted of certain violent offenses to serve at least 85% of their sentence before becoming eligible for parole consideration. 85% of 25 years means he must serve more than 21 years before any potential review. Attention now shifts to Case 7, Watertown, New York, 1972. Arthur Shawcross killed 2 children in this small city near the Canadian border. 10-year-old Jack Owen Blake disappeared in May 1972. 4 months later, 8-year-old Karen Ann Hill vanished. Both were found murdered in Jefferson County. In 1973, Shawcross pleaded guilty to 2 counts of first-degree manslaughter in Jefferson County Court. He was sentenced to 25 years to life in a New York State prison. He served approximately 14.5 years. In April 1987, he was released on parole. He did not return to Watertown. He moved west to Rochester, New York. Within a year, Rochester would become the center of one of the most disturbing serial murder investigations in New York State history. Rochester sits along the Genesee River in Monroe County. In the late 1980s, parts of the river corridor were lined with industrial lots, wooded areas, and isolated stretches beneath bridges. After his release in April 1987, Shawcross settled in Rochester with his wife. He lived in Monroe County under parole supervision. On March 18, 1988, Mari LaRosa, age 27, disappeared in Rochester. Her body was later discovered near the Genesee River. This was the first confirmed post-parole murder. Over the next 22 months, more women were killed in Rochester and surrounding Monroe County areas. The victims included Anne Marie Lucille, Patricia Ives, April Nobile, Kim Morin, and Mary Ann Pryor. Their bodies were found along the Genesee River corridor in wooded embankments, near industrial zones, and in isolated patches of brush. Autopsies conducted in Monroe County revealed a consistent cause of death: manual strangulation. Several victims were mutilated after death. At this time, Shawcross remained under parole supervision in Rochester. He kept scheduled meetings. He maintained a residence. There were no immediate parole violations that would justify revocation. The crimes were happening in Monroe County, while the supervision structure operated on documented compliance. As 1988 progressed into 1989, Rochester police began to connect the cases geographically. The Genesee River became the defining location. A multi-agency task force formed in Monroe County to investigate what was now believed to be a serial offender targeting vulnerable women, many of whom were involved in street-level sex work. Meanwhile, Another body was discovered outside Monroe County. In neighboring Wayne County, New York, Elizabeth Gibson was murdered in 1989. Her case fell under Wayne County jurisdiction rather than Monroe County, complicating coordination across counties. By late 1989, the pattern was undeniable. Victims located near the Genesee River in Rochester, strangulation, consistent body disposal patterns. Police intensified surveillance in Monroe County, particularly along streets known for sex work activity near the river corridor. On January 3, 1990, in Rochester, Monroe County, investigators were conducting surveillance near Lyell Avenue and other river-adjacent areas. Shawcross approached an undercover officer posing as a sex worker. After he drove away, officers stopped his vehicle within Rochester city limits. Evidence inside the vehicle, including rope and items later connected through forensic analysis, linked him to the Genesee River murders. He was arrested in Monroe County. The killing stopped immediately. In November 1990, Arthur Shawcross was tried in Monroe County Court, Rochester, New York. He pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity. Defense experts testified about mental disturbance. The prosecution presented evidence of deliberate targeting, concealment, and rational conduct demonstrating awareness of wrongdoing. On November 5, 1990, a Monroe County jury convicted him of 10 counts of second-degree murder. He received 25 years to life for each count, ordered to run consecutively, totaling 250 years to life in Monroe County. Separately, in Wayne County, New York, Shawcross later pleaded guilty to the murder of Elizabeth Gibson. That additional conviction ensured permanent incarceration across jurisdictions. He was sent to state prison under the custody of the New York State Department of Corrections. Arthur Shawcross died on November 10, 2008 at Sullivan Correctional Facility in Fallsburg, New York. Case 8. Detroit, Michigan, a bus stop on the city's west side, September 16, 2015. The location was ordinary, the kind of place people pass every day without marking it as significant. A stretch of pavement, a posted route sign, traffic moving through familiar streets. Stanley Carter, 59 years old, a former U.S. Army Ranger, was standing there waiting for transportation home. He had served his country years earlier. On that evening, he was simply waiting for a bus. A man approached him. There was no recorded argument echoing across the street, no long exchange drawing attention from bystanders. According to witness accounts later reported in the Detroit Free Press and by WXYZ Detroit, the interaction was brief. The suspect came up to Carter. Police would later describe what followed as a robbery attempt. Moments later, Carter was shot. Emergency responders arrived. The scene shifted from routine to fatal in seconds. Carter died from the gunshot wound. The public record is clear about what happened next. Police identified the shooter as Malcolm B. Benson. 8 months earlier, Benson had been released from prison. He had served approximately 19 years for a 1995 homicide. The sequence is exact and documented. 1995 second-degree murder conviction in Wayne County. January 13, 2015, release on parole. September 16, 2015, fatal shooting at a Detroit bus stop. In 1995, Malcolm B. Benson pleaded guilty in Wayne County Circuit Court to second-degree murder and felony firearm. The charge stemmed from a fatal shooting in Detroit. Rather than proceed through a full trial, Benson entered into a plea agreement with prosecutors. That agreement resolved the case without a jury verdict. He received a sentence of 20 to 40 years in prison. Under Michigan law at the time of his conviction, parole eligibility could occur before the full minimum sentence had been served. The Michigan Parole Board retained discretion to evaluate inmates based on institutional conduct, participation in programming, disciplinary record, and other review factors. Parole was not automatic, but it was possible prior to completion of the minimum term. Benson remained incarcerated for nearly 19 years. During that span, Michigan's sentencing framework changed. In 1998, 3 years after Benson's conviction, the state enacted what became known as Truth in Sentencing. The reform required individuals convicted of serious crimes to serve their entire minimum sentence before becoming eligible for parole. It altered release calculations going forward. Benson's conviction predated that reform. That timing would later matter measurably. Because his crime occurred in 1995, his parole eligibility fell under the earlier system. Had his offense taken place after 1998, he would have been required to serve the full minimum term, approximately 22 years, before any release consideration. Instead, after serving roughly 19 years, he was released on parole on January 13, 2015. The release followed the legal process in place at the time of his conviction. The parole board reviewed his case. The available records indicate he met eligibility requirements under the governing law. He walked out of prison under supervision. 8 months later, that decision intersected with another life. On September 16, 2015, Stanley Carter stood at a bus stop in Detroit. Carter was a 59-year-old Army veteran. News coverage described him as a former Ranger, a detail that reflects his prior service, but does not change the immediate reality of that evening. He was waiting for transportation. According to reporting from the Detroit Free Press and WXYZ Detroit, there was no evidence of a heated exchange or prolonged confrontation before the shooting. Witnesses told reporters the suspect approached Carter. The encounter did not unfold as a drawn-out dispute. Police described the incident as a robbery attempt. Carter was shot and died from his injuries. The suspect identified by authorities was Malcolm B. Benson. 8 months after parole, police arrested Benson shortly after the shooting. Prosecutors charged him with first-degree murder, felony firearm, and related offenses connected to Carter's death. The case proceeded through the Wayne County court system. When the legal process concluded, the sentence was life in prison without the possibility of parole. The structural repetition emerges plainly in the record. First homicide, firearm. Second homicide, firearm. The first conviction resulted from a confrontation that ended in a plea to second-degree murder. The second involved what police characterized as an attempted robbery at a bus stop. The victims were different men, separated by 2 decades. But the common denominator is lethal gun violence committed by the same individual. The timeline compresses the pattern into months rather than decades. 19 years of incarceration, 8 months of freedom, a fatal shooting. The April 2016 sentencing hearing marked the legal end of the second case. Benson received life without parole for Carter's murder. The sentence was definitive. There would be no further eligibility review. Our focus now shifts to Case 9. On November 9, 2021, in Rayton Spur, Worksop, Nottinghamshire, police enter the home of 73-year-old Pauline Quinn. Inside, they find her dead. The attack is violent. Her injuries are extensive. Her neighbor is arrested. His name is Lawrence Bearton. At the time of this killing, Bearton was not a stranger to the justice system. He is serving a life sentence outside prison walls. He is on license for murdering 2 elderly women in 1995. This is not the story of a sudden collapse. It is the story of time stretching and snapping back. Because before this house became a crime scene, a prison gate had opened. May 2020. After more than 2 decades in custody, Lawrence Bearton is released on life license. To understand this moment, we must move backward. June 25, 1995. Rotherham, South Yorkshire. 79-year-old Aileen Doodle and 72-year-old Elsie Gregory are attacked inside their home. Bearton and an accomplice, Michael Pluck, bludgeon the 2 women to death. After the killings, they set fire to the house. In 1996, at Sheffield Crown Court, Bearton is sentenced to life imprisonment. Under the law in England and Wales, life imprisonment includes a minimum tariff, the minimum time that must be served before eligibility for parole review. After that period, the parole board evaluates whether continued detention is necessary for public protection. Bearton is first released in 2017. In 2018, he is recalled to prison after concerns about his behavior. Then, in May 2020, he is released again. The assessment concludes that his risk can be managed in the community under supervision. A life license does not mean freedom without oversight. It means strict conditions. It means recall is possible at any sign of escalating risk. On paper, the structure is cautious, but parole decisions are not certainties. They are judgments, and judgments rely on what can be measured: behavior in custody, psychological reports, structured risk tools. What cannot be measured as easily is resentment that sits quietly. Now we move forward again. Worksop, 2021. Bearton lives near Pauline Quinn. According to court evidence reported by BBC News and Sky News, tensions emerge. He seeks money from her for alcohol. On November 9, 2021, when she refuses, he attacks. The weapon is not carried in. He uses her own coffee table. Judge Mr. Justice Parole later details the injuries in court: 29 separate wounds. The attack is described as sustained and brutal. This is not a single strike. It is repeated force. Blunt force in 1995. Blunt force in 2021. Elderly women attacked in their homes in 1995. An elderly neighbor attacked in her home in 2021. Different county, different decade, similar vulnerability. After the 2021 killing, questions surface about supervision. Reporting later confirms that an alcohol monitoring condition had previously been removed. The probation service acknowledges serious failings, including accommodation decisions placing Bearton next to elderly residents. But these acknowledgments come after the fact. Because on November 9, 2021, Pauline Quinn is alone in her home, and the risk assessment from May 2020 is no longer theoretical. It is physical. Lawrence Bearton stands before Nottingham Crown Court. He is convicted of the murder of Pauline Quinn. This time, the sentence is different from 1996. A whole life order, no minimum term, no future review for release, no further parole consideration. In sentencing remarks published by the Judiciary of England and Wales, the judge emphasizes the severity of the attack and Bearton's history of prior murder convictions. The court concludes that the seriousness of the case requires permanent imprisonment. The gate that opened in 2020 will never open again. Case 10. Records describe McDuff as compliant in prison. He avoided major infractions. He did not display open aggression within the controlled structure of incarceration. But prison behavior measures compliance within strict boundaries. It does not necessarily measure predatory capability outside them. In October 1989, after serving 23 years, McDuff was released on parole. He entered a society very different from the one he had left in 1966. He was required to maintain employment, meet regularly with his parole officer, abstain from illegal activity, and remain within approved locations. On paper, this was conditional freedom. In reality, it was a reclassification. In 1967, a Tarrant County jury had sentenced him to death for the August 6, 1966, kidnapping and murder of 3 teenagers near Everman, Texas: Robert Brand, Edna Sullivan, and Brenda Joyce Meeks. After the 1972 Supreme Court ruling, his sentence was commuted to life imprisonment. 23 years later, eligibility and institutional conduct outweighed the memory of 3 graves. The system recorded stability. But what does stability mean inside a cage? The crimes that first placed McDuff in prison were not spontaneous. On a summer evening in 1966, he and accomplice Roy Dale Green abducted 3 teenagers at gunpoint near a baseball field in Everman, Texas. Robert Brand was shot. Edna Sullivan was strangled. Brenda Joyce Meeks was sexually assaulted and murdered. The violence was controlled, directed, mobile. A jury imposed 3 death sentences. They were overturned only because of constitutional change, not because of doubt about guilt. Inside prison, McDuff adapted to structure. He learned compliance. He avoided overt confrontation. But incarceration restricts opportunity. It does not erase capacity. When parole boards review files, they examine disciplinary history, time served, and conduct reports. In the 1980s, Texas prisons were overcrowded. Administrative pressures were real. Parole eligibility often became a function of institutional behavior and calendar calculations. McDuff qualified. The first signal was subtle, the belief that absence of prison violence equaled absence of risk. No psychological transformation was documented publicly. No formal declaration of rehabilitation reversed the nature of his original crimes. He was simply eligible, and eligibility became release. After his October 1989 release, McDuff moved through Central Texas. Employment was inconsistent. He worked temporary jobs. He associated with individuals involved in drugs. Witness testimony later placed him in nightlife environments where vulnerable women were present. These were not capital crimes. They were instability markers. Between 1989 and 1992, at least 6 women were murdered in patterns that later traced back to him. In 1989, Seraphia Parker was abducted and killed. In 1991, Colleen Reed, a 28-year-old Austin accountant, disappeared from a car wash. Her abandoned car was found with signs of struggle. Her body was later recovered in a rural area. Also in 1991, Regina Deanne Moore and Brenda Thompson were murdered. In early 1992, Valencia Joshua and Melissa Northrup were abducted. Northrup vanished from a Waco convenience store parking lot on March 1, 1992. The pattern mirrored 1966: public abduction, transportation, isolation, sexual violence, remote disposal. But these crimes were initially investigated separately across counties. Jurisdictional lines divide information. Patterns require coordination. Meanwhile, parole supervision documented routine matters: check-ins, employment verification, address records. Missed meetings were not automatic revocation triggers. Relocation required paperwork, not alarm. The second signal was cumulative instability. Individually, each violation was manageable. Collectively, they formed mobility without constraint. When investigators later overlaid McDuff's movements with disappearance dates, the alignment was stark. But at the time, no single violation crossed the threshold for immediate reincarceration. Systems are often built to respond to confirmed crimes, not behavioral drift. By early 1992, law enforcement task forces began connecting cases. Media attention intensified. Witnesses placed McDuff near multiple crime sites. On May 4, 1992, he was arrested in Kansas City, Missouri, after fleeing Texas. The warning signs had matured into confirmation. In 1993, McDuff was convicted of capital murder in Travis County for the killing of Colleen Reed. The jury sentenced him to death. Additional prosecutions followed in other jurisdictions for the murders committed after parole. Unlike his 1967 death sentences, this one survived appellate review. On November 17, 1998, Kenneth McDuff was executed by lethal injection at the Huntsville unit in Texas. The state's second judgment was final, but the central tension remained unresolved. We now turn to the final case. Under Thai law, life sentences can be reduced through royal clemency and accumulated good conduct credits. Over time, his sentence was commuted. By 2019, he became eligible for release. Somkid Pumpuang had been convicted in 2006 for murdering 5 women between January and June 2005. The killings occurred across multiple provinces, including Udon Thani and Nakhon Ratchasima. Court findings established a consistent method. He approached women through casual contact, built brief familiarity, isolated them, strangled them manually, and stole small personal belongings before leaving. The crimes unfolded within a compressed 6-month window, creating a pattern that investigators later described as deliberate and repetitive rather than chaotic or impulsive. He had originally received life imprisonment. In 2005, Thai police arrested Somkid after linking him to those 5 murders. Reports at the time described how he gained proximity to women working in hotels or massage parlors. Once alone with them, he attacked. The evidence trail was often limited, but similarities across scenes, method of killing, victim profile, and the theft of minor valuables allowed investigators to connect the cases. When confronted, he confessed. In 2006, the criminal court sentenced him to life imprisonment. Thailand's justice framework allows for sentence reductions through royal clemency decrees and credit for good conduct while incarcerated. These reductions are not uncommon, particularly during major national events or royal occasions. In 2019, ahead of the coronation of King Maha Vajiralongkorn, clemency measures affected thousands of inmates across the country. Sentences were recalculated under established legal provisions. Eligibility depended largely on the type of conviction, time served, and institutional behavior. Somkid qualified under the criteria. There were no widely reported public objections at the time of his release. Official statements indicated he had maintained acceptable conduct while incarcerated. Within the controlled structure of prison life, he accumulated the necessary credits and met the formal requirements. Institutionally, the decision aligned with statute. His life sentence, already reduced through successive commutations, reached a point where release became lawful under Thai corrections policy. On May 17, 2019, after approximately 14 years behind bars, he walked free. Prison behavior is measured within confinement. The structure is rigid, movement is controlled, opportunity is restricted, compliance inside that environment is observable and documentable. Serial homicide, by contrast, often depends on access and opportunity. When freedom is removed, so is the capacity to act on violent impulses. The system's evaluation focused on time served and conduct recorded within the prison walls. When the gates opened in May 2019, the calculation was straightforward. The revised sentence had been completed. The legal threshold had been met. What it could not measure was whether the pattern established in 2005 had ended or merely paused. For months, there were no headlines, no public incidents. The release did not immediately trigger alarm. He reintegrated quietly into civilian life. 7 months later, on December 15, 2019, hotel staff in Khon Kaen discovered the body of Rasami Mulashan, age 51, inside a guest room. She had been strangled. CCTV footage showed her entering the room with a man. Later, the same man exited alone. The sequence was clear on surveillance recordings. Arrival together, departure alone. Investigators reviewed the footage and quickly identified the individual from still images. It was Somkid Pumpuang. The method resembled the crimes from 2005: brief contact, isolation, manual strangulation. The similarities were immediate and unsettling. Within hours, national news outlets reported the development. Public reaction was swift. Many questioned how a man previously convicted of 5 murders had been released after serving what they viewed as only part of a life sentence. Authorities launched a nationwide manhunt. Police distributed surveillance images across media platforms and asked the public for assistance. The search lasted 3 days. On December 18, 2019, passengers aboard a train in Lopburi province recognized him from widely circulated images. They alerted authorities. Police intercepted the train and arrested him without incident. Reports indicated he confessed during interrogation. The gap between release and re-offense was 7 months, approximately 212 days. The pattern from 2005 had reappeared in 2019 with striking similarity. The interruption created by incarceration had ended. The behavior had resumed in a manner consistent with his earlier crimes. In January 2021, the Khon Kaen Provincial Court convicted him of Rasami's murder and imposed a death sentence. Thanks for watching. Please like the video and subscribe to help us continue uncovering the truths that deserve to be remembered.